In this section, we'll examine the ways in which the imperatives of the capitalist economy affect the role of the United States in the global economy and the relations among countries. I'll start by introducing a very important concept, that of imperialism. Imperialism refers to the economic and political domination of one country by the dominant class of another country. Notice that imperialism does not just involve states or countries, it involves classes. Second, the term imperialism applies not just to formal empires, such as, say, the British or the Roman Empire, but also to cases in which a powerful state controls another state informally. For example, most analysts believe that the United States has had an informal empire in Latin America, where many countries at certain times have been very much dominated by the United States. The phenomenon of imperialism predates the rise of capitalism. Rome built a huge empire, and it was a slave-based economic system. However, the capitalist era saw the rise of the greatest empires, both formal and informal, in history. So the key question that I will take up, if briefly today, is why does a capitalist system tend to produce imperialist relationships? Imperialism is an important topic. Imperialism has played a role in the evolution of capitalism over time. It leads to wars with huge costs in blood and treasure, and it involves domination and humiliation of whole populations. So let me turn to the US in particular. The United States was born starting in 1776, when the US Continental Congress approved the Declaration of Independence. These united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. This was a statement of the right of a people to be independent and the right not to be ruled by a foreign power. Yet, less than 100 years later, something happened in 1898 that was very different from the ideas expressed in the American Declaration of Independence. In 1898, President McKinley had to decide what to do about the Philippines, where there had been an uprising by the Philippine people that had thrown out the Spanish who had dominated them as part of the Spanish Empire for centuries. And an American warship cruised into Manila Harbor, and Admiral Dewey telegraphed President McKinley and said, "Have arrived in Manila Harbor. I am awaiting instructions." Reportedly, McKinley paced the White House floor, tortured by the problem, how can a democracy born in a war of independence hold a colony? Well, by morning, he'd resolved the problem. And he said, there was nothing left for us to do but to take them all, and to uplift, civilize, and Christianize them. Well, President McKinley was a little weak on history. The Spanish had been busily Christianizing the Philippine people for several centuries, and they felt they'd had enough of it, although perhaps in those days a Protestant president didn't regard Catholicism as part of Christianity. The Philippines became a colony, a formal colony of the US, lasting until 1946, almost 50 years. This raises the question, why between 1776 and 1898 did the United States go from the Declaration of Independence to an imperialist stance in the world? The political economy answer to that question is, in between those 2 years, capitalism arose and became the dominant economic system in the US. So let's look into the relation between capitalism and imperialism. Capitalists, in their pursuit of profit and their accumulation drive, tend to spread their activities across national boundaries for several reasons. To get cheap labor, which can often be found in less developed parts of the world, to sell more effectively in foreign markets. It is possible for capitalists to sell in foreign markets by exporting, but there are often advantages to producing in a foreign market. And thirdly, to obtain and furthermore to control the raw materials that capitalists need. The profit motive and the accumulation drive of capitalist firms lead them to, first of all, export goods to expand their market. Secondly, to export capital, either in the form of direct foreign investment, which means building or buying production facilities abroad, or financial foreign investment, which means lending money or buying bonds and other securities abroad. Third form of expansion is to find and get control of raw materials located abroad. There's an interesting quote from one of America's best-known former presidents, Woodrow Wilson. He was president from 1913 to 1920. In 1907, 5 years before winning election as president, Wilson stated, "Since trade ignores national boundaries and the manufacturer insists on having the world as a market, the flag of his nation must follow him, and the doors of the nations which are closed against him must be battered down. Concessions obtained by financiers must be safeguarded by ministers of state, even if the sovereignty of unwilling nations be outraged in the process." So economic expansion that emerges out of the basic profit and accumulation drive of capitalism leads, as Woodrow Wilson noted, to political domination. Here are some of the underlying aims of the political domination that goes along with economic expansion. When capitalists expand into a part of the world where capitalism has not yet arisen, they want to create the conditions for capitalist exchange and production in the dominated country. So, for example, when capitalists found precious metals in Africa where the local people were happily engaged in subsistence farming, they needed to get workers to do the mining. And so they brought their government, the European countries brought their governments with them. They imposed a tax in money on the local people, and lo and behold, the local European-owned mine was happy to hire people for a wage. That's an example. Second, as the major capitalist countries built up large empires, they wanted to limit competition from capitalists based in other imperial powers. And so the power of the state, the British, the French state, was used to make sure that no capitalists from other powerful countries would locate in their spheres of control. Third interest that brings the state in is to protect against possible local threats to particular economic interests of the dominant country capitalists. For example, Cuba was effectively a neo-colony of the US, starting in the 1890s when the Spanish were expelled. And US companies controlled the major industry in Cuba, which was sugar refining. And they needed a large sugar harvest at the time of year when the sugar cane came due. And as a result, the US interests wanted to maintain a large impoverished population who would be available to work at low wages at cane cutting time. Every Cuban social reformer wanted to redistribute land to the large landless population, and the US government saw to it that that did not happen for many decades until the Cuban Revolution of 1959. One more motivation is to keep the dominated country open to foreign investment. The biggest threat is to the capitalists in the powerful country is that their investments may be nationalized or they may not be allowed to make new investments, and they need political control to prevent a party from taking office in another country that might not allow them free access to their markets. Imperialism has always had justifications. How to explain why one powerful state should dominate the people in another region. Racial or national superiority has been given as a motive, and the British Empire was justified by a belief in the superiority of, quote, the white race. Bringing civilization to the natives has been a prominent reason, even when the British took over India, a country with a much longer civilization than that of Britain, bringing true religion to the natives, whose religion might not qualify as a real religion in the eyes of the imperial power. In more recent times, such justifications as preserving or bringing democracy or freedom, although rarely is democracy or freedom a result of imperial conquest. Another is to prevent certain countries from building or acquiring weapons, which one powerful country thinks they are not qualified to own. And still another is protecting human rights, a very selectively applied justification, where some countries that do abuse human rights find themselves falling under severe pressure from a powerful capitalist state, while others that abuse human rights go without any mention. The different United States attitude, for example, toward Iraq versus Saudi Arabia. Finally, fighting terrorism seems to have become an all-purpose excuse for exercising military power all around the world. Imperialism has serious consequences. It has given rise to wars of conquest. For example, the Japanese war in the early part of the 20th century to conquer China, which was a very brutal war. Wars of independence, such as the American Revolution and the Vietnamese War for independence, first from France and then from our country, the United States. Third, what are called wars of inter-imperial rivalry. There's a long history, going back centuries, of wars between capitalist powers that were competing over resources and spheres of influence. World Wars I and II can be viewed as fully or partially, in the case of World War II, wars of inter-imperial rivalry, with the huge costs of those wars. And in general, the squandering of resources of the imperial power. A question to think about: what groups or classes in the US benefit from US domination of other parts of the world? Do all Americans benefit? Do only capitalists benefit? Do workers benefit? What groups or classes are harmed by imperialism? That's something to consider. Thank you.